Right, so this next slide is a piece of sheep's lung. So much more complicated organ, got quite a bit going on here. When you've seen the structure, the function may be a little easier to understand. So the stains that are used on this particular section to give it the colours are the two that we've already seen, so that's staining the cells pink and the nuclei purple, but there's an additional stain on this which stains cartilage a sort of violet blue colour. Now the cartilage in the lungs is basically a continuation of the cartilage that you can feel in your throat here, in the trachea. There are rings of cartilage around the trachea that hold that airway open, and those rings of cartilage continue on as the trachea branches smaller and smaller in the lung. It's still got these rings of cartilage around the airways that hold the airways open. The other things that we're going to see is we're going to see the alveoli, which are these air sacs, which is where the air ends up eventually, and that's where the gas exchange takes place between the blood and the air. We're going to see airways, we're going to see blood vessels, because half the output of the blood from your heart is going straight to the lungs, so there's a lot of blood vessels. We'll see the cartilage, we'll see some smooth muscle, and we'll see the airway linings, which are ciliated, and cilia are very fine hairs that line the upper airways of the lung, and we'll talk about those a bit more in a minute. So just before we look at this under the microscope, I'm just going to look at the real thing for a moment and just talk about how the what we're going to see under the microscope slide differs from what the lung would be in a live animal. So here we have heart and lungs from a sheep, and just going to demonstrate how different the lungs are when they're actually in the animal, as opposed to when we've taken them out of the animal and then take a small piece from those lungs to have a look at under the microscope. So I've got here a tube connected to a gas cylinder, and the tube is in the trachea. So I'm just going to blow these lungs up to the sort of size that they would be naturally inside the animal. So when they're collapsed, they are probably less than half the size that they would have been. So probably about that sort of size is what these lungs would have been when the animal was alive. And when it breathes in and out, they're only going between about there and there. So not much of the air is actually exchanged in the lungs in normal breathing. But then if I take the tube out, you can see how as soon as the chest is punctured and you destroy the seal between the lungs here and the inside of the chest, the lungs collapse. So when we are cutting a section of it, it's a collapsed lung. All the alveoli are a fraction of the size they were. The tissue sort of squashes those very small airways. So it has a different appearance to what it would have had when the animal was alive. So just to give you the textbook sort of picture of what the lungs are like, you've got two of them. The airways, these blue structures around the airways is representing the cartilage. So the airways go from the trachea, which branches into the two lungs, and then branches and branches, smaller and smaller, right down into these very, very small air sacs. And these air sacs, the alveoli, is where the gas exchange takes place. So that's where you get the blood supply and the air close together allows us the oxygen to diffuse into the blood and the CO2 to diffuse out. So under low power, the lung looks like this. And basically what you're seeing here is very much a spongy sort of material. As I said before when we looked at the real thing, all these little air sacs here, which is what all this is, would be much larger. So there'd be a lot more white and a lot less pink. That would all be stretched out. So all of this is air sacs, and these structures here are airways which are supplying the air to those air sacs. The reason that these airways have got this sort of folded up star shape, they look a bit like starfish, the reason they have got that shape is because when that lung collapsed, it squashed that little airway. So that airway would have had a nice open channel through the middle of it, but when the lung collapsed, it squashed it and folded up the inside. So that's what we're looking at here. Mostly the air sacs. All of these air sacs will be connected to these little airways. So we have a look at these airways under higher magnification, or this is actually a larger airway here. So round over to the left here, there's all this spongy alveolar tissue. This here is a larger airway. These three big sort of purpley blue structures are cartilage. So this airway has got cartilage around it. That's why it's remained open. It hasn't folded up. That cartilage has held it open. That cartilage would form a ring because of the way it's cut. It doesn't quite look like a ring, but it would have formed a ring right round that airway. So in the middle here is the air. Then you've got a dark staining, dark sort of pinky purple staining layer, which is the epithelial layer, if you like, of the airway. And then there's this pink band which runs around the airway there. That is smooth muscle. So that muscle, if it contracts, will reduce the size of that airway. The muscle runs around the airway, so contraction of that muscle squeezes the airway and makes it smaller. And when that happens when you don't want it to, that's asthma. If you're asthmatic, this little band of muscle here reacts when it shouldn't and contracts and restricts that airway and makes it hard to get the air into the lungs. And then you can see the cartilage band, and outside of that we have alveolar tissue. The other structures that we can see here, so up on the top left here, there's another open space with a pink band around the outside of it. That is a large blood vessel, be a large artery. The blood vessels tend to follow the same route as the airways. So where you find airways, you tend to find blood vessels. And again, they divide, so that's an artery. It will divide into arterioles and then down into capillaries when it gets into the alveolar tissue. So that's an artery there. There's another one here following the course of the airways. So going into this sort of alveolar tissue, all these little air sacs here, and here we've got a little tiny airway, and there's no cartilage associated with this airway. And when you get an airway without cartilage, it's called a bronchiole. The previous one that we looked at that still had cartilage around it is called a bronchus, but when there's no cartilage, it's called a bronchiole. And because it doesn't have the cartilage, it's been squashed, and that's why the inside here has folded. Here is a little artery associated with that airway, so following the same track. And under high power, these are these air sacs. So running through all this pink tissue here will be tiny little blood vessels. These are capillaries. When you get to capillaries, it means that gases can now diffuse out of the blood and into the air, or from the air into the blood, and these gases move down their concentration gradient. So there'll be more oxygen in the air in these little air sacs than there is in the blood, so the oxygen will diffuse into the blood, and there'll be more carbon dioxide in these little capillaries than there is in the air here, so the carbon dioxide will diffuse into the air. And that's how your lungs function. You get the air close to the blood and allow the gases to diffuse down their concentration gradients. And it's all taking place in these tiny little air pockets called alveoli. So going back to that larger airway, the bronchus, here we've got a higher magnification, so this is the air here, this is the lining of the airway, and you can almost see on the lining it has a slightly hairy appearance. There are cells in this lining of the airway which secrete mucus onto the inner lining of the airway, and these tiny little hairs on this lining move that mucus continually out of the lungs. So that's how your lungs keep themselves clean. You're continuously secreting mucus onto the linings. That mucus will trap any particles that you breathe in, and then they get pushed out of the lungs by these little tiny hairs, and it's continuously coming up to the back of your throat and being swallowed without you even being aware of it. Inside here is that muscle there. This is smooth muscle. The difference between smooth muscle and striated muscle, apart from the appearance, this will not have those lines across the fibers. So striated muscle has that name because of those stripes, but functionally they're different too. With skeletal muscle you have conscious control over the muscle. With smooth muscle you don't. So you can consciously control the movement of skeletal muscle, but this is all under control. This smooth muscle is all unconsciously controlled. And here we can see the cartilage. In here there's a few air pockets. These little pockets here will be cells secreting mucus, and that little gap there will lead back into here, and the mucus will be going from here through into the airway. Here's the cartilage, and you can see the little cells that are buried in the cartilage, and they basically secrete the cartilage around them. These are called chondrocytes, so the little cells buried deep in that cartilage secreting the cartilage around them. And here it's just a high power, and you can see the cells there, you can see their little nuclei, and then we've got connective tissue holding that cartilage to its surrounding tissues.